Troops were secretly loaded into dozens of cargo ships, destination unknown. Only later the ship captains were informed. They were headed for Cuba. 42,000 soldiers were kept in the ship's holds under top security. Only at night could they go on deck for fresh air.
It was Khrushchev who did it all, with his closest associates. I was chairman of the KGB, and I still did not know of nuclear warheads being delivered there. Nobody asked my advice.
It was one of the greatest secret operations of the 20th century, but the secrecy itself was very nearly a catastrophic mistake. When the Americans discovered the missiles, the Russians needed only 2.5 hours more to make the missiles operational. Soviet Foreign Minister Gromyko and Ambassador Dobrynin tried to convince President Kennedy that there were no Soviet missiles in Cuba. They lied. The secret installation and continued lying by the Russians indicated to the American government that these missiles were intended for a secret strike against the U.S. To Kennedy and his advisors, the nuclear threat was very real. They discussed and argued over their options to find a response, to safeguard their people and their country while preventing an all-out nuclear war. Of all possible countermeasures, from invasion to threat to nuclear first strike, Kennedy chose the most balanced one. He ordered a sea blockade of Cuba. Americans lived through terrifying days. Panic started. People bought out food supplies. They feared U.S. military action against Cuba and a retaliatory strike at the U.S. The nuclear nightmare had become reality. The American Navy took positions along a blockade line around Cuba. Because of the time difference, it was evening when the Russians got the news of Kennedy's speech and the American response. Khrushchev had misjudged Kennedy. He'd sensed weakness at the summit in Vienna. Now he was surprised and frightened by the U.S. resolve. U.S. nuclear missiles, now on alert, were targeted at 200 Soviet cities and strategic sites. The Americans were enraged. Khrushchev immediately summoned his closest circle. He was extremely nervous.
He was at a loss. He did not expect such reaction, such behavior from the Americans. He looked for a way out.
Soviet ships were nearing the blockade line. Some carried R-14 nuclear missiles with enough warheads to cover the entire United States. The U.S. had indicated its intent to prevent this by force.
He said, well, the missiles are now approaching Cuba. They will be in place there, and we're approaching a big blow-up. He said, well, it's too late to change anything now.
The missile-carrying ships were accompanied by Soviet submarines equipped with nuclear torpedoes. U.S. Coast Guard planes registered their engine noise. Tensions grew. The distance between the American and Soviet ships grew smaller, smaller. Soviet freighters were now 2 hours from the quarantine zone.
The crisis crackled, it sparked, like a high-tension cable which is dropped on you and sparking in all directions. And speaking for myself, actually, I just wondered, how are we going to get out of this? I mean, it was Wednesday, then you've got this other problem, of the naval blockade, of the Soviet ships moving to the blockade. Would they stop? What happens if they didn't stop?
Khrushchev still delayed his decision, hoping for a miracle. But there was no way out. He ordered the missile-carrying ships to stop, then to turn back. On the 24th of October, the military clash was avoided. But what would have happened if Khrushchev's orders had come too late? The Americans won the first round. The Soviet ships carrying missiles turned back. But the key problem remained. Soviet nuclear weapons were still in Cuba. the U.S. prepared for military action. Troops were sent to Florida and to the Caribbean. Moscow became extremely worried. On the 27th of October, the CIA ordered a U-2 on a reconnaissance mission over the Soviet pads to determine whether they were ready to launch missiles. Cuban anti-aircraft guns opened a barrage fire, but the U-2's altitude was too great. They could not reach it. Then the U-2 appeared on Russian radar screens. One of the Russian officers gave the order to fire. The battery was equipped with the new Russian C-75 missiles. Unknown to the Americans, they could reach the U-2's altitude. The missile tracked the American reconnaissance plane. Neither Moscow nor the commander of the Soviet troops in Cuba had given the order. Neither Moscow nor the commander was aware of the launch. The American plane was hit. The pilot, Major Rudolph Anderson, died in the crash. It was clear to Kennedy and his advisors that only a Russian missile could reach the plane. They couldn't imagine that it could have been launched without a direct order from Moscow. Did it mean the Russians were starting the war? To the Cold Warriors, it seemed so. The American generals insisted that Kennedy order an immediate preemptive strike on Cuba before the Russians could launch their remaining missiles at the United States. At this moment, Kennedy received a telegram from the U.S. Embassy in Moscow. The embassy had just received a most urgent message from Khrushchev. The future U.S. ambassador Matlock was to translate it.
He speaks excellent Russian, so they rely on him. But everybody in Washington is saying, hurry up, I need it now. He's saying, do you know how hard it is to translate Khrushchev? I mean, Khrushchev is a peasant, and he uses all this sort of not-so-nice language. You know, while back in Washington, they're wringing their hands, trying to figure out when the next piece of the letter is coming in.
When Washington got the message, the Americans were confused. Then it became clear Khrushchev was still trying to bargain. He didn't realize how critical the situation had become. It seemed he didn't know about the attack on the U-2 and therefore hadn't intended it. Pressed by his advisors and by the clear threat to U.S. security, Kennedy had no choice but to send Khrushchev an ultimatum. All he could do was to soften its style. Robert Kennedy informed the Russian ambassador that if the Soviet Union didn't remove the missiles from Cuba, the U.S. was ready to start a large-scale operation to destroy them. To back up the ultimatum, Kennedy alerted the U.S. military forces. Now the U.S. and Soviet Union were one step away from nuclear war. But now the American position was fixed. The initiative, the sole decision over whether the world would plunge into nuclear war, was in the heart of one man, Nikita Khrushchev.
This is the only time in history that the nuclear missile sites in North Dakota and in Nebraska had the lids removed. But clearly, there's a message being sent here. I've hit that button, and there's only one button left to hit.
The Soviets reacted immediately. The lids on their launch pads opened to bear the missiles. Both American and Soviet strategic nuclear bombers took off. The Soviet Army declared a red alert. Along with their East European satellites, NATO went to full alert. In the night of October 27th, 28th, Castro sent a coded telegram to Moscow. According to his information, the United States intended to invade Cuba within 24 hours. Only then did Khrushchev realize the gravity of the situation. If Americans landed in Cuba, the disaster was inevitable, for Khrushchev had another deadly secret. The greatest Soviet secret, one that was not revealed for 30 years, was that beside the medium-range nuclear missiles known to the Americans, there were other nuclear weapons in Cuba. Weapons unknown to the U.S. president, to the generals, to the CIA. In Cuba, the Soviets had secretly placed winged tactical Luna missiles with nuclear warheads. They had bombers on Cuban airstrips and boats armed with nuclear missiles. These weapons had no fail-safe devices. They could be triggered by their crews. Moscow was not in control.
But he tried to avoid invasion because he understood he will lose the control over the situation because communications are very poor at that time. And who will make decision to use nuclear weapons? Nobody knows. Because it was very easy at that time. You can switch the key, like in the car, and then push the button. It was nightmare to my father. You can imagine, in all this fire, explosion, dying lieutenant, captain, surgeon will push this button, and then at last it will be the end of the world, end of the civilization.
Khrushchev gave instructions to call a Politburo meeting the next morning on the 28th, and I was there, and it took place at a dacha outside of Moscow. It was decided to give an answer as soon as possible.
Nikita Khrushchev loved the nuclear bomb. He loved the power it gave him. He embraced the policy of nuclear bluff. He was comfortable on the brink of nuclear war. He was the biggest brinksman of the 20th century. But now he'd come too close to the edge, to within a blink of nuclear disaster, of the end of civilization. It sobered him, and he realized the only way to preserve peace, to protect his country, to prevent a worldwide catastrophe, was to remove the missiles from Cuba. In return, President Kennedy agreed to remove U.S. missiles from Turkey. The Cuban crisis was over, but not the Cold War. It would last for another 30 years. There would be wars in Africa, Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia, Afghanistan, uprisings in Eastern Europe, and many other conflicts. But never again did one side directly threaten the other with nuclear weapons. The weapons were too deadly, too final, and finally too hard to control. The two superpowers backed off from direct confrontation. From now on, the war would be fought by surrogates armed with everything but nuclear devices. The leaders and the world had been scared straight. By the end of the 20th century, the Cold War had become history, and the strangelove factor, the realization of the inherent insanity of nuclear conflict, may have saved the world.